Hi everyone, obviously I've just been introduced, but I am Stefanie and I am a communication designer and artist who likes to work with data above all other design materials. So I create data-driven designs for both art commissions and commercial work, ranging from information design to creating physical objects, animations, and public installations using data. Examples of which include this piece at the Olympic Park, or it was at the Olympic Park in East London, made using slightly chaotic data that school children had collected from the park, not for statistical insight, but instead to inform the design of a new data-driven park landscape. Or it might mean this collection of 1,000 small drawings on index cards that visualize data from the 1,000 most frequently used English words, not to draw statistical insight, but instead to highlight the beautiful and colorful variation in the English language and then displayed at a British Council pavilion at a book fair in Mexico. Or it could also be like this piece for Facebook's London campus, where to communicate the attractive quality of a powerful Facebook post, I loosely visualize data from a very, very, very long post on my timeline. So that white dot is the original post, and then all of these shapes are all of the different comments and GIFs and photos and videos from different people that then followed on. And so I used that data to inform the design of a mural at Euston's office, Facebook's offices in Euston, and then that's what the final looked like painted on the wall. So all of those were created with data, and as you can see, these aren't your traditional bar charts or pie charts, and it's definitely a different way of working as an artist or designer. So how did I end up here? I never really expected to be doing this when I first started studying as a designer. So it's a very different space. But it actually started when I was in my early 20s and I moved to London. I have an American accent, so if anyone hasn't heard it. I moved to London for an MA in communication design. And so while I was there, I was working on a project I called Writing Without Words, where I gathered data from the novel On the Road by Jack Kerouac, and then explored ways of visualizing this data. So this very early project influenced my design practice in many ways, as this was 11 years ago, and for a variety of reasons, I was unable to access a digital version of this novel. And so I had to gather all of the data from the book by hand, highlighting and marking the pages like what you see on screen. And, of course, I wouldn't do this if I were doing this project today. I would work with developers to help automate various processes. But this early constraint further influenced me to often work with data in a very handmade way. And so you'll see this influence through some of the projects that I'll be talking about today. So in this early project, I would explore different methods of visualizing text, like this piece from the series where I was visualizing the underlying structure of part 1 of On the Road to highlight the underlying hierarchy found within this piece of literature. So it's over there on the right, and part 1 is represented by a tree diagram, very simple tree diagram, showing how it splits into chapters, which split into paragraphs, sentences, and then words. And then this whole diagram is color-coded according to key themes found within the novel. And at the time, about a decade ago, I called this sort of thing mapping. I didn't really see myself going into data visualization. I didn't really know what it was. But I did know that I wanted to do something with literature. So a year out of my master's, I got what I thought was my dream job, and I became a book and book cover designer at a UK publisher. And I thought that this would be my main focus for the rest of my career. And I still sometimes work in publishing, but only a little bit now, and kind of in a different way than before. And so I was working here, and at the very same moment when I was working there, we were going through our recent data visualization renaissance, where there was this rise in the use of diagrams and data visualization as a way to communicate messages to a lay audience, as opposed to only scientific or business analytic audiences. And because of this excitement and interest in data viz, while I was in my publishing day job, my MA project kind of went viral on the internet, and I had an inbox flooded with emails and freelance requests. And so that's when I decided to quit my job and go freelance to work in this growing design field. And so that was about 8 or 9 years ago. And so I was a freelance data visualization designer, information designer, and I was giving a lot of talks about this project at the time, and people would often ask, an audience member would ask, well, what's the key insight? What is the key truth revealed through presenting this data, as though I had created a science experiment or a sort of piece of data journalism? And I couldn't really answer, as I had initially wanted to visualize, really, the reason I visualized this text was to mainly draw attention to its hidden underlying structure, to its hidden underlying complexity, and to show how a piece of literature that you care about is something living and breathing and alive, which is the reason I wanted to translate this piece of literature into an organic sort of plant-like diagram or representation of it. So for me, I was visualizing the data faithfully to communicate how I had felt about the book emotionally. And that's when I realized, looking at this more closely, that much of my work fell in a different category. It wasn't quite scientific data visualization, it wasn't a newspaper information graphic, but what was it and what was I? And so this was a point of reckoning for me. And so I thought, well, I need to sort of clarify my position a little bit more in regards to how I work with data. And so this is the best way I can describe the type of work that I do. I just say that I'm a designer, illustrator, artist, or whatever, delete as appropriate, whose favored creative material above all others is data. So for me, as a designer, working with data felt like a natural fit. And I am surprised that more designers don't work in this way, because it makes sense that in this day and age where we all create data almost just by breathing, that this would be a plentiful material for designers to work with and also to critique. So other people might use photography or pencil or collage to represent the world they see, but for me, I'm choosing to use data as a way of responding to my subject matter. So as you can see with this way of working with data, I use data as a starting point to communicate messages that go beyond the insights found within the data set, where my end intention is to create work or communicate a message that is often more emotive or more subjective than what you might traditionally find within a traditional chart or traditional data visualization. And also, for me, I see data viz as a design process that one can use to work with this design material, with data. And I do think that this is a process that, as we move into the future, will be as common a method for a designer to create and communicate with as much as the golden mean, color theory, design systems, and all of the other rules of thumb and tools that designers use daily to create harmonious, structured designs. Now, a very recent example of how I use data in this way, as this material akin to pencil or ink or watercolor to respond to a subject. It can be found when I was recently commissioned by the NHS to create artwork for every room in the inpatients wards at the Royal Papworth Hospital, which is a heart and lung hospital located near Cambridge that's going to be moving to a shiny new site at the Cambridge Biomedical Campus next year. So I was commissioned to create artwork for the inpatients rooms, and it was to be placed on these glass doors across the front of each patient's room. And so it would be seen from the inside of the room as well as like the corridors of the hospital. And I knew I needed to create artwork for 192 rooms across 3 floors. So I knew I needed to automate the process, and that's when the developer Mike Braunbeard came on board. So, besides the enormity of creating artwork across so many rooms, I had to fulfill the brief given to me, where the artwork commissioned for the hospital was to focus on the theme of the living building, consider the human body and be human scaled, and then, of course, to be calming to patients who had have come out of, incredibly intensive surgeries in some cases. And so, taking that into consideration, I came up with the following response to the brief. So the rooms were across 3 floors, so I decided to create 3 different designs, one for each floor that focus on the core parts of the body that the hospital specializes in, and these are very kind of basic and not very medical. So the heartbeat and the heart, the breath and lungs, and then the blood and blood flow that connect the two. And then to incorporate nature into the building, I decided to focus on how there are similar landscapes and patterns found both inside the body and outside in the world. So waveforms are found in heartbeats and waves in the oceans and seas, and then branching is found both in lungs and trees, and then flowing patterns are found both in blood flow and blood vessels as well as rivers. And so this was my response to the brief, and then I proposed that I wanted to create this work using data relating to the heart and lungs as my material, as the starting point. So then, and this would ensure that every single inpatient's room would have a completely unique design. And so I won this opportunity, and then I had to figure out how to make it happen. So I started to research what data sets were available to match these 3 areas of the body. Originally, I decided to work with ECG or electrocardiography data to represent the heartbeat, spirometry test data that is used to diagnose issues with the lungs, and then also echocardiogram data, so that which is a test that shows the pumping capacity of the heart and like the intense. This is not a very technical description of it. And then it also measures the intensity of the blood flow being pumped out into the body. And so when I was talking to the committee at Papworth, we agreed that using anonymized data directly from patients and staff there would make a compelling connection between the artwork and then the wider hospital community. So I had to find ways of accessing this data from that hospital. And so I was able to access some data sets from Papworth researchers, but the ECG data wasn't kind of readily accessible. So I replaced that through gathering pulse data from one's finger using a very lo-fi pulse sensor, just because it was the easiest way for us to get the data that we needed to work with. And so Mike and I spent a day at the hospital collecting pulse data from the Papworth community of staff and inpatients and outpatients to inform the artwork's design. So, once we had all the data, that was our material, and we used that as a seed to create a unique artwork for each room that incorporated these natural patterns of flowing, branching, and waveforms into the design. And so on screen are just some very close-up examples of what the 3 final designs look like, and colored according to the wayfinding and interior design palette for the hospital, where the design is very calm, simple, spare, and linear. And this isn't a traditional data viz, so I'm not designing something to keep all the online chart critics happy, but I'm thinking about using data as a material to create a space for someone who's come out of surgery for a pacemaker or bypass surgery or heart transplant and so on. And so just an example of what some of these look like in more detail. For one floor, I used research echocardiogram data to create a natural flowing pattern where the number of particles and variability and turbulence of the flow is dependent on various data points from the echocardiogram. So this is just what a few of them look like. And then so each one is unique. And then on another floor, Mike created a program for me to work with the collected pulse data. So then I could loop and trim this data in various ways to create these subtle waveform patterns, which again, this is just an example of a few of them on screen. And then on the final floor, I was using the spirometry data, the lung data, to inform variation in a series of branching plants that alluded to the branching found in the lungs. And then just a quick run through an example of how that design plays out across a few different kind of designs. And I mean, that was just a very quick sort of taster of the project. And here are a sneak peek of some photos of the work sent to me during the install, though I haven't been able to visit it and document it on site because it will be open for patients sometime next year. So I look forward to seeing it. So here I'm using data as a design material and data visualization as the design process to create work for this incredible space. So yeah, that is a different way of working with data. And I have often found, it kind of falls in the borders of a few different spaces. And I have found for some parts of the data viz community that there can be a need to strictly define these borders between data viz and art or data viz and communication design, and never can any of these spaces meet. But for me, I see these borders as blurry, and I like to work in this blurred in between with, I put objective in quotes because, objective data viz on one side and more subjective communication and graphic design on the other. And depending on the project, I balance the sides in different ways. So sort of enjoying this challenge of working in between spaces and not quite fitting. So finally, just talking a little bit about how I work. Seeing data viz as a design process has also challenged me to extend the visual languages that designers use to work with data. So I'm continually striving to move beyond the bar chart and experiment with data viz in the same way that a communication designer might normally push the limits of any other aspect of their field, like typography or layouts, illustrations, and so on. And so through this, I aim to explore ways of presenting data that, besides being legible, are more memorable and more expressive to a layperson audience who might just be learning about data for the first time. So that might mean making data danceable, like this project as the first data artist in residence at Facebook in California, where I converted a month of a couple's interactions on Facebook timelines, the caveat, all with their consent, into dance steps, bringing their digital dance across timelines into a physical space. Or it could also mean making data hoppable, like my open data playground for the South Bank Centre in London from a few years ago, where hopscotch games were created from open data sets in order to communicate how open data sets are put online for anyone to interpret and play with however they choose, even if some of those interpretations are less conventional than others. Or it could mean a project that's touchable and wearable, like this art commission I created with Miriam Quick, where we explored physical ways of communicating open air quality data from Sheffield in a memorable, experiential way for a citizen audience who might not be interested in air quality data or data in general. So one part of the project presented weeks of particulate matter as something you could touch and wear. And then the other part communicated a day of pollution levels in Sheffield through glasses that would make your vision more or less hazy and polluted depending on the data. So that was a very quick run through a lot of the work that I do, where I do try to visualize data to communicate messages that go beyond insight, hopefully in new ways that are more memorable, engaging, and accessible. But even when rendered in these more playful ways, I found that talking about data and getting people to care about it is still a challenge. And I think many people, and probably many of you as well, see data as boring and inaccessible. It's definitely not something that you talk about at dinner parties. It's true because data can feel like an indecipherable, intimidating topic to many people. Even to me, I'll confess right now and say even I don't adhere to all the data privacy advice and data checks I should. I think in many ways, I even feel that I'm really seeing only the tip of the iceberg. And so I think, the idea of data can feel overwhelming even to someone who's made their career from it. So, but I think that this is because for many lay people, data feels like something that's far removed from their daily lives, bigger than they're able to comprehend, cold, clinical, computerized, hidden away in big blue servers like in this photo of a Google data center. And so I think if we want people to begin to care a little bit more about this and be interested in something that is not going away and will be part of their lives for the foreseeable future, then maybe we need to find a different approach, a different way of sort of presenting this concept to them. And so I feel like I've been getting closer to understanding how to make the concept of data more accessible through this next project that I'll show you. And this is from a few years ago. It was a recent collaboration with Giorgia Lupi, the creative director of the information design agency Anorak, based in New York and Milan. Giorgia and I had met only twice in person when in 2014 we decided to collaborate with each other. And we wanted to collaborate because we have a lot in common, both personally and professionally. And the main thing really being that, you know, I can code like this much, but really I don't code very much at all. But we both prefer to work with data in this very handcrafted analog way that I described earlier, which is in contrast to the often, oh, that is my necklace, isn't it? It is the necklace. I was told that this necklace was dangerous, so I'm just going to take it off. Okay. Yeah, in contrast to the often standard use of computing and algorithms as part of the data viz process. And so, you know, we wanted to collaborate, and so we decided to challenge ourselves. Since data visualization was the language that we spoke for work, we would use this language to get to know each other better, ideally in a very analog, hand-drawn way. And so together, we came up with a project we called Dear Data, which was a year of hand-drawn, sending each other hand-drawn data postcards back and forth across the Atlantic. So the way that this worked is that starting on the 1st of September in 2014, and then lasting a year, every week we collected our personal data around a shared topic, like what you see on screen, in order to investigate aspects of ourselves and our days that we then share with the other person. And then at the end of the week, we would spend time analyzing our data, and then we would painstakingly draw our visualizations and their annotations on a postcard, and then once we were finished, we would drop the postcard in our mailbox or post box and wait with our fingers crossed. And if all went well, because it didn't sometimes, the postcards would arrive at the other person's address, and then we would grab a coffee, sit down with the postcard, and then read and learn more about the other person's life. All of the postcards followed the same structure. The fronts of the postcards contain no text or explanation, just the drawn data, and then the back of the postcard obviously has an address and stamp, but also a legend explaining how to interpret these drawings. And through this format, every week became this exploration of small data made very personal due to its inherent imperfections, where even our choices in our data collection and of what we each chose to include and not to include functioned as a unique representation of each person. And so over the year, the whole project became this fragmented self-portrait created through data sent to the other person. And so just to show briefly how the project unfolded and developed over the year, I'll just show a few postcards in more detail that sort of illustrates some of the topics and themes we were looking at. So yeah, so we started it with week one with quite an esoteric, strange data set where we were gathering data on how often we checked a clock to see what time it was for that week. Then for the second week, we tracked how we moved around our respective cities. And here we turned a movement tracking app on our phones to gather this data. And this was the only time we used an external app to automatically track us. It felt like we weren't really in control by letting the phone do the work. So as the weeks progressed, we mainly explored themes requiring manual data collection, focusing on what computers can't gather, or at least not yet, and trying to move beyond the usual quantified self-data into something more akin to personal documentary, where the main pursuit was to use this data capture to sort of make sense of our world, to connect and be present in our days and week, and then also to create a souvenir of our lives to then send to the other person. And then as we went through the year, we gathered data on a variety of topics, like lighthearted topics like our drinking or our swearing, which is shown on screen. Or we would try to capture data on the most fleeting of emotions, like trying to track a week of our laughter, which is an almost impossible pursuit. And then we extended the project beyond real-time gathering, so where we would survey parts of our lives for the other, like surveying our collection of books on screen or our music collections or our wardrobes and so on. And then since gathering data on your behavior inherently changes your behavior, we also tried performative data tracking, where we tried to gather particular data sets in the hope that that data gathering would make us change our behavior in a positive way, like trying something new, which is on screen, or smiling at strangers, or being kind of nicer to the people around us. And so then, we did this for 52 weeks, and after a year, we had a collection of 104 hand-drawn data visualizations. So that was a very quick run through the project, considering how long it took to make it. It is sort of an all-consuming project, but all of the postcards are close-up and you can see them close-up and in detail. They can be found in book form, published by Penguin in the UK. So that was a really nice result of the project, where it has all of the postcards, and then it tells the story of the year and just all of the things that unfolded, with lots of illustrations that sort of illustrate the story. So we had to figure out how to draw real things as well. Yeah, so that's the project, but a lot has come from that. But first, so we did this project for a year. Well, what did we learn? What did we learn from this year of collecting and drawing our data? I think firstly, it made us believe in the benefits of human-scale data. We found that this small scale we were working on opened the idea of data to a wider audience and made it more approachable. And because the project would look at domestic and often mundane data that most people can relate to, we were able to show that data is something that's simply in every aspect of our lives, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be scary or intimidating, though still sometimes it can be. And secondly, by gathering and analyzing, drawing our small data in this manual way, we have also been able to highlight how when learning basic principles of working with and visualizing data, that you don't need fancy programs or incredible data analysis skills to begin. All you really need is a pencil to start. So this is my cheesy upbeat slide that I like to add here. But it does work because it has really resonated with people. We received emails from people starting Dear Data correspondence projects of their own, or using it as part of their teaching materials from primary school to university and beyond to help students learn to collect and present data. So you can see like a wider audience has connected with this project in a way we never anticipated. So this started from a project of 2, and it became this sort of wider community project. And that has, had started me thinking about this. But because besides the insights that I just mentioned, what aspect of the human experience were we tapping into that made people excited about this small data, or at least take more notice of data that they might not have even given them like a data project to look at before? Now, as I've mentioned, and as you can hear, I'm an American who's spent almost 16 years in the UK, so I'm also British now. And so over time, while I've been here, I've been able to spend time better understanding the idiosyncrasies of British culture. And as I've made my home here, at some point I stumbled upon a British slang term that piqued my interest, and it's the slang term Anorak. And this is now one of my favorite words, so I love this word. So for those of you, just as a bit of background, the actual definition of an Anorak is this sort of utilitarian coat with a hood that's waterproof that you wear outdoors when it's raining. But the slang version of the word Anorak is someone who is interested in the collection of minuscule, arcane, and quite often useless bits of information. And so the slang term derives its name from the anorak jacket stereotypically worn by train spotters as they stand on a coal train platform, carefully noting down the numbers of all the locomotives as they pass by, similar to the guy that you see on screen. So this is your stereotypical train spotter, but let's take a closer look at the notebook he's looking in, or he's writing in. And here on screen is a notebook of a train enthusiast called Trevor Ermel from 1967. And so you can see Trevor has noted down the date and the day of the week, and then carefully listed all of the locomotive numbers down the page, adding different contextual details if required. And here, the train spotter, he doesn't collect data for statistical insight. You know, he's not a data scientist or an analyst, but instead he's collecting data. You know, the primary focus is connecting with a subject that he cares about. And besides the trusty notebook and pen, the other tool in a train spotter's arsenal is one of many publications that compiles a comprehensive list of all the locomotive numbers organized by their classes and capabilities. And this is an example on screen. This one is from 1950, where the spots in the previous notebook would be carefully transferred to these booklets, where the spotted locomotive numbers were carefully lined with a pen and a ruler. And so for me, I find this little unassuming booklet incredibly moving as a record of someone's experience of getting closer to something they care about through observing, collecting, and marking. And after researching train spotting, I began a search for other types of spotters or anoraks for whom the process of observing and collecting this small and mundane data offers satisfaction. And I'll show you a few more examples, starting with lorry spotters. So my favorite lorry spotter community that I've discovered are Stobart spotters. Would anyone consider themselves a spotter of these trucks? I don't know, I've just learned about it. I think it's really interesting. It's a community of 25,000 people who spot vehicles by Eddie Stobart, a massive transport firm with all sorts of vehicles moving things across the UK and Europe. And the appeal in this type of spotting is that the company gives every vehicle a name, normally a woman's name, though we will leave the question of why only women's names for another talk. But you can see a couple examples of these names on screen. So there's Elizabeth Phyllis and Rainbow Valentina. So they're really grand names that all the trucks, the lorries have. And you can become a member of their fan club, and one of the key benefits of this is that you can access the most up-to-date spotters handbooks with the names and the full fleet. So then as you drive around the country, you can tick them off your list. And then I found another community of anoraks, UK-based, ground hoppers, whose goal in life is to visit as many different football stadiums as possible. And this pursuit is formalized with the 92 Club. And so to be a member of this club, a person must attend an association football game at the stadium of every current Premier League and Football League club in England and Wales. And if you become a member, you could get a lapel pin or tie to show off your achievement. So over on the right, we've got a club application form from the 80s where they collect data about each match: date, ground, team, opponents, score, and attendance. Again, they won't visualize this data. They won't make a statistical analysis of the various attendances, but this is a way of documenting, of keeping track of a particular experience. And now on to global anoraks, starting with fans that fill out baseball scorecards at American baseball games. I was talking to some people in the audience that we met when I was giving a talk 8 years ago about baseball scorecards, and I'm still talking about it. So if you haven't ever scored a baseball game, this is how it works. A scorecard is double-sided with one team on each side with innings across the top and the players in batting order down the side. And using a set of cryptic abbreviations and notations, you notate each play as it happens in the game. And then when the game ends and the scorecard's filled, fans normally don't go home and begin to analyze the data collected, but instead they keep that filled out scorecard as a souvenir. So it's not meant for analysis, but the main reason for this data collection is to stay in the moment and to be present and to be less distracted and to ultimately get in the game and to add to the enjoyment of spending a few hours at the ballpark. And another global Anorak community can be found in the bullet journal community. And the original bullet journaling method was created by an American designer named Ryder Carroll. And it has a large community, but as the community's grown, this original minimalistic method gave way to these detailed, elaborate journals filled with color and like hand-drawn habit trackers, emotion trackers, sleep logs. Now, all of these could be tracked by an app, but they enjoy the satisfaction of putting pen to paper to record and document their life. And then finally, the final Anoraks group is, of course, global birdwatching. And on screen is an example of a birdwatcher's logbook in the UK, where with train spotters, you can carefully tot up all of the birds you spot over a year or a lifetime. And there's space to add more qualitative data and even different symbols or abbreviations to notate further information about birds as well. Now, there are many others, but these are just a few examples of anoraks, and you can see they all manually collect data and observations for many of the same reasons we did in our Dear Data project, where through observing, they make sense of a subject they care about, making a connection through being present and aware, and where this data they collect, it functions as a memory, a souvenir of this experience of engaging with their passion. So if you look at the train spotter's usual output of an anorak, and then you look at the output of my design process, and you look at all of our Dear Data postcards, it's pretty obvious that we are card-carrying anoraks as well. So after research, we found our people. But unfortunately, as you can see in the film, the term anorak is derogatory and negative. It seemed to be nerdy, uncool, and antisocial to be collecting data on the things you're passionate about. But I, as an anorak myself, I disagree. But I think one of the reasons is that these ways of working with data, they don't really fit with traditional perceptions of what data and data collection should be used for. And because of this, I consider much of the data anoraks and others collect to be something I'm terming outsider data or folk data. So data collected by amateurs for reasons that might not necessarily include statistical insight or be rigorous enough to keep data scientists happy, or data collected by communities whose passion doesn't have any social currency, like the nerdy train spotters, or data collected by people who might not really think that they're collecting data in the first place. And so many of them are these people creating outsider data or creating outsider data visualizations, where many of these visualizations or proto-vises are imperfect, often designed only for an audience of one, and where often the experience of drawing and making the visualization is more important than legibility or insight. And I think this research into outsider data collectors reinforces a belief I have about anoraks, that everyone is an anorak, even if they don't realize it. I think we all collect seemingly useless numbers and store them away as we move about our day. So, many of us know our precise weight, watching every tiny creep up and down the scale, or we might mark places we visited on a wall map at home or collect all the bands we've seen. And I think many of these small numbers could be considered as meaningless and as useless as the data an anorak collects. But I think this imperfect outsider data, even if sometimes considered useless, is valuable because the act of collecting data on a topic, any topic, means it's important to the author and brings the author closer to subjects they care about. So looking at the data you gather as a seeker anorak is a way of figuring out what's really important to you. And so I think really it's just another way of documenting and better understanding one's world. So some people document with photos, journals, videos, and other people document with data, spreadsheets, and tick marks. And so I think when we look at data in this way, we see a different view of data. It's not cold like big data, but something that's warm and part of the human story. And I think the reason our project was successful is that it speaks to the latent Anorak tendencies we all have, where we're all data collectors, even if we don't realize it. And finally, what's really exciting is that many of the themes that I've touched upon, they've come together in a second book we've released, Observe, Collect, Draw, which is a visual journal published by Princeton Architectural Press that most ages and abilities can use to document their lives through gathering and drawing their own data. So we just released that a couple of weeks ago. So this is how it works, where in the journal, we sort of help guide people along. So we help them learn how to collect their data, and we provide some drawing rules that they can add to, and then they can draw their data on the other side. So it can be things like using your past as a data set, where following the rules on the left, you draw it on the right, or you can draw your friendships and their related data on the right to better understand your relationships with them. Or you can think more carefully about how you dress yourself, and then with or what makeup and products that you use and the clothing you wear for different occasions by following the rules on the left and drawing it on the right. And so here we're trying to change how you talk about data, reframing it into something that appeals to the human Anorak tendencies we all have. So trying to tap into that secret data that many people collect without realizing it and treating it as valuable. And so the book was only launched a couple of weeks ago, and so we're seeing so many great responses on social media, where instead of being static and fixed in a moment in time like our Dear Data book, I know I'm a minute over, this journal is beginning to take on a life of its own and become something dynamic and ever-changing, where we're building a new community of anoraks, and so we're excited to see how it unfolds. So just to conclude, after working on all of these projects, I believe more than ever that we don't have to collect and visualize data for statistical insight, but data is material that can be used in a variety of ways. And so data is now this in-between material, much like I work in an in-between space, where a data set can be a scientific and analytical material, and that data scientists and data journalists work with, and a cultural artifact that artists might respond to, and also the souvenir of an experience as collected by an anorak, eliciting completely different responses in these spaces, and all of these responses are valid and valuable. And I think really it's this experiential data collected by secret anoraks that's the key to making data and data viz as concepts more accessible to a wider audience. So that's it. Thank you.